Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending this talk. I know we are almost at the end of the day, so bear with me for just a half hour, and I'll try to make it worth your while. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. If you know a little bit about me, I wrote this blog when I was on Google, which got pretty popular, became a standard that is now adopted by Apple, Google, IBM, Cisco, Microsoft, not Microsoft, but Okta, and a few others, including my company, Signal. And so I've been a standards person, and that might be a disadvantage for this audience because the reputation is that standards work very slowly. But I would like to bring the best parts of it into MCP, and that's sort of where I'm coming from. So the thing that I think everybody recognizes is that MCP is a very broadly applicable technology. It is something that can be used in the enterprise. It can be used in consumer situations, internal, external. Everything can be done using MCP, and that's kind of one of the problems that with MCP, that because it is so broadly applicable, how do you do enforcement of certain policies which are only applicable in very specific use cases? And that's kind of the dilemma that the MCP standards body kind of faces, is that, hey, while on the one hand we want to support the whole community, we don't want to make it hard for everyone to implement MCP. If certain constituencies want some more control, they should be able to have it, but it shouldn't be something that is pushed down the throats of everyone in the MCP community. Right? So how do you do that, right? So just before we get into that, let's get into a few examples, right? So for example, MCP optionally supports OAuth as a way of doing authentication or authorization, as you've heard. But OAuth has a number of options, and so how do you make sure that only certain options are useful in certain situations, like in the enterprise, right? How can an enterprise enforce that behavior? And in another consumer situation, right? So this is the policy that an enterprise wants to enforce, which is that we want to have OAuth, but we want to have it with that JWT based client assertions, client credentials flow, right? How do you make that happen, right? And you don't want this for example, for consumer services. So how do you do that? And another problem here is that the same enterprise that is having its own MCP servers may be using third-party SaaS services. If I'm an enterprise, I'm using a third-party SaaS service. That SaaS service is also supporting a lot of other enterprises, and they may not have the same policies as me. So how is all this going to work with MCP? The other example that I'm giving is a little bit outside my comfort zone, but something that I've heard from people is that even if I'm running an MCP that is consumer facing, I may want to have different service tiers. How do I enforce that with MCP, right? So all of these things can be achieved using profiles. So what profiles do is they can mandate a certain set of behaviors or properties. They can extend MCP to features that are currently not supported by MCP. For example, you can say, I want my tokens to be at a max only 2 hours in duration, right? That's something that the MCP standard doesn't even talk about, but you might want that in a profile, right? And so how can these enterprises and service providers get these kinds of assurances without having to burden the whole community? And we believe that something like this will unlock the rapid adoption of MCP in the enterprise. And so that's why this is interesting to all of us, right? So profiles is fundamentally a very simple idea, right? The idea is that you mandate a certain set of behaviors. You may include certain additional features that are not in the protocol. And it's where it stands right now is it's a pretty old SEB that was created, I think, in July. And it basically specifies 3 things. It's very simple. It specifies how to specify a profile. And then it specifies how to discover whether a server supports a certain profile, or which profiles does a server support. And thirdly, it has a way to negotiate between the client and the server the choice of the profiles you want to use, right? So there's sort of these three aspects to that SEP. Now, an example of, I'm going to take an example that I'll kind of run through in this whole presentation. There's a fictitious company called Wholesale Chips, and they want to mandate the use of certain properties. So specifically, it wants to define its own profile, and that profile is located at that particular URL. So the specification URL of the profile is what uniquely identifies that profile, right? So if you want to define some profile at some other URL, that becomes a different profile. And the Wholesale Chips, as a large organization would, they use internal MCP servers as well as third-party SaaS services, right? So it's something that you'll find is very common in enterprises, right? So what the profile is doing, and you don't have to read through all this. This is just the preamble anyway. The next slide is a little more interesting. It's just a YAML document or a markdown document that just specifies what you mean by the profile, right? And this is even more text, so you can take a picture and read it later. But the most important thing here is it's going to specify, okay, you have to get a token from this OAuth server. You have to get, you have to support SPIFFE, and you have to go to this particular Spire server to get the JOT and things like that, right? So this is a very concrete, like, you have to do this kind of thing that is not going to fly for the whole community, but it's going to work for that one particular enterprise that wants to use this, right? Now, when I have a server, let's say I have an internal MCP server, what I would say in my server is that I support these profiles. Now, there's a mechanism in IETF called a well-known sort of document. And so I'm proposing that we use this well-known document called MCP Supported Profiles. And in that, you specify all the profiles that your server supports, right? Very simple. And it also specifies which minimum MCP version that profile can be used with. So if your client is not capable of that version, then you won't be able to use that particular profile, right? And you see that this server supports two profiles. You'll see one which is at that Wholesale Chips location. The other one you see is in the MCP sort of domain. And I'll explain to you what that is. So there's a slight distinction between these two profiles, and I'll talk about what that is as well. So how do the client and the server, so you've specified the profile at a particular URL. You know how to discover it by going to that well-known document. Now you know what the server is supporting, so how do you actually negotiate the use of certain profiles? So what you do is, in the initialize request of the MCP protocol, you have an additional field called requested profiles. So the client says, hey, I want to use these profiles with you, right, in this session. Now the server will get that list, and they'll say that, oh, with this particular client, with this particular user, I can only use these profiles. So they're going to send another set of profiles in the response, which is in the initialize result, right? So they'll have a profiles field in the initialize result that tells you which profiles they're going to use. If the client and server can agree that that's a good set to continue, it'll work. Otherwise, the client can drop the connection, the server can reject the request. And so you can enforce policy in this way, because in an enterprise, if you have control over the client, you can configure the client to say, I only can use these profiles. If you cannot connect with these profiles, then all bets are off. We don't want to talk to that MCP server, right? And so this is how you can actually negotiate and enforce policy in your enterprise. And I'll also explain to you how this works in the consumer use case as an example at the end. I'll talk about. So far, so good. So this is just, the new fields are requested profiles in the request and profiles in the result that you see there. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was one profile that was defined at a location which was wholesalechips.co something something, and there was another profile which was in the model context protocol.io domain, right? So the difference there is that if the whole community agrees that such a profile should exist, and let's call it a high security profile, right? Not everyone wants to use it, but there is a common understanding that there is such a profile, right? So let's say we all come together and say there is a high security profile, and we define it within the MCP repository. That is what we are calling a standard profile, right? Whereas everything else that is not in the MCP repository becomes a custom profile. Now, just because there is a standard profile doesn't mean you have to use it. It means that you have the choice of using it. So in your organization, you might say, there is a standard profile. I want all my clients to only support that particular standard profile. So if they cannot connect with a MCP server using that standard profile, then the client should drop the connection, right? So you can configure your MCP clients to do that. But let's say some other use of MCP, I as a consumer want to use some video streaming service. I don't care about the high security profile. And so that client might just ignore the existence of that profile. So in this way, you're sort of adding something to the spec that is completely optional, but it is something that everyone agrees on as a standard thing to do, right? Right, I think I covered this slide. So now let's take an example of how I showed you how a server would say that, I'm going to support this wholesale chips profile because I'm an MCP server that is developed and is internal to wholesale chips. It's very simple, right? Now, what if I have a SaaS service that is actually shared across a number of enterprises, right? How can I support a custom profile defined by one of my tenants, right? So the SaaS service has to make a choice whether or not they will support that profile from wholesale chips. And let's say wholesale chips is this giant company with trillions of dollars of market cap, and every SaaS service wants to work with them. They're going to say, okay, I want your business, and I'm going to support this particular profile. So this service called SaaS will decides to support the wholesale chips profile, and how it does that is that the well-known URL for that particular tenant of SaaS. So this tenant is wholesale chips, SaaSRS.com/wholesale chips. The well-known URL for that has the wholesale chips, in its path, right? This is specified in the IETF RFC about well-known documents. And so this is a standard way of, identifying which particular profile you're looking at or which particular metadata document you're looking at. That metadata document, when you get it, it's going to say that I support that wholesale chips profile, right? And so as a result, if another tenant, and the same thing works simpler with like wholesalechips.saasrs.com, which is another strategy that many SaaS services use, which they give you a subdomain per tenant. You just have that profile located at, or that metadata document located at that subdomain, right? And so this just gives you an example of like the flow, which is you first discover the profile supported, you get the list of profiles supported, then you put that in your requested profiles in the initialize request, and you get back the initialized result with the supported profiles. If you like the profiles that are supported in the result, you continue, otherwise you drop the connection. If the server doesn't like the profiles you're requesting, the server can just drop the connection, right? So it's enforced in both ways. Now, if a profile unaware client, let's say SaaSRS has another company that they're as their customer called Retail Chips, and Retail Chips doesn't care about profiles. They are unaware of profiles, or maybe they support some other profiles. What Retail Chips MCP client will do is it'll not put the requested profiles member in the request, in the initialized request to the SaaSRS service. As a result, the SaaSRS service will say, okay, this is a profile unaware client, and so I'm just going to respond with an initialized result that doesn't have the profiles field in it, right? And so everything works like a default that SaaSRS supports, right? So in this way, you can simultaneously, as a SaaS service, support both profile-aware clients and profile-unaware clients, right? Where So now there's another example, which is the video service. Now this is, I'm imagining a consumer service where it supports two tiers. Let's say it supports the sort of standard tier, which has some resource limitations. It has some, video quality limitations and stuff like that. And there's a premium tier, which is available to paying customers, and that actually can support, much more, it doesn't throttle the API. It gives you high quality video and stuff like that. And the LLM might have to change its behavior based on what kind of tier it's going to use, right? So it might be more chatty with the service if it's a premium tier, but it might be less chatty with the service, knowing that it's going to be throttling and it's going to cost more money or things like that, right? And so what it can do is when the initialized request goes to the video service, based on the user authentication, it can decide that this is either a standard tier or a premium tier, right? So the requested profiles may say, I want to use either the standard tier or the premium tier, but the response will only contain the standard tier in the response, so that you know that the LLM will know that the user cannot use the premium tier, and as a result, it'll be able to adjust its use of the service. So this is how you can adjust the quality of, or you can address the consumer use case in this case, right? So I'm at the end of my slides. I'm sure you have a few questions, so you can ask them. But before we go there, here's a link to the SEP that we have, and I would encourage you to go to the SEP, provide your feedback, provide your comments, and of course, would love to hear more from you about what you think.